People usually think the most ruthless betrayal comes with screaming. The truth is, the deepest stab wound happens in dead silence while your enemy smiles over a glass of champagne. I was ready to throw away a $1 billion empire for true love, only to discover my future in-laws planned to erase my heritage completely. If you want to see arrogant socialites methodically crushed on their own turf, pull up a chair. You will not look away. Hello, beloved listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for always being here and supporting our channel with such kindness. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely no operating budget to continue, which means we are forced to pause all new uploads here for the foreseeable future and transition our operations completely over to Patreon. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community, where you will get to hear even more incredible, exclusive true stories that are significantly longer, featuring highly detailed situations that we simply cannot publicize on YouTube, and brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors within a single episode. You can easily join us by scanning the QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link located right in the video description and the pinned comment below. Now, let us dive right into today's story and meet our main character, Kira Espinoza. I am 26 years old, and by a simple twist of birth, I am the sole heir to Alejandro Espinoza. My grandfather is a man whose name commands absolute fear and respect across the entire state of Texas. He built a ruthless, sprawling empire in the green energy sector and commercial real estate, acquiring vast stretches of land and crushing his competitors without a single second thought. For my entire life, I was meticulously groomed to eventually sit at the head of a massive mahogany boardroom table, draped in designer silk, and commanding literal armies of corporate lawyers, but I deeply despise the cold, sterile, and calculating world of the ultra-elite. I flatly refuse to become just another useless trust fund baby, born with a silver spoon in her mouth, completely detached from the gritty reality of hard work. So, I made the conscious choice to walk away from it all. I left behind the sprawling mansions and the suffocating high society expectations, packing my modest belongings into a couple of duffel bags and moving down to Austin. I desperately wanted to feel the real earth under my fingernails. I took a physically demanding, dirty manual labor job as a plant care specialist at the Verdant Canopy Conservatory, instead of a luxury penthouse. I proudly rented a tiny, cramped space in a quiet trailer park on the dusty outskirts of the city. I bought and drove a rusty old Ford pickup truck that rattled violently every single time I hit a pothole on the highway. I learned exactly what it felt like to sweat completely through my work shirt by 10 in the morning, and I found a strange, profound satisfaction in having to calculate every single dollar and cent I spent on gas for the week. For the first time in my 26 years on this earth, I was genuinely free. I was no longer the billionaire heiress. I was just Kira, the girl with permanent dirt on her knees and thick calluses on her palms. It was during a highly exclusive charity fundraiser held right there at the conservatory that my new, peaceful world abruptly collided with his. The facility management had required all ground staff to stay late into the evening and help serve the wealthy corporate donors. I was exhausted, carrying a heavy silver tray of appetizers through the intensely humid tropical greenhouse, when a heavily intoxicated guest stumbled directly into my path. Instead of offering a polite apology, the red-faced man sneered in absolute disgust at my plain canvas uniform. He deliberately shoved his plate forward, dumping a sticky, rich sauce all over my apron and my heavy leather work boots. "Watch exactly where you are going, you clumsy piece of trash," he slurred loudly, causing several heads to turn in our direction. I stood there, thoroughly humiliated, biting my tongue hard enough to taste blood just to keep my fiery temper in check. Before I could even formulate a response, a man stepped incredibly smoothly between us. It was Declan Sterling. He was a young, exceptionally slick real estate developer draped in a perfectly tailored dark navy suit, possessing a smile that seemed to effortlessly charm the very air around him. "I firmly believe an apology is in order, sir," Declan said, his tone incredibly steady but remarkably soft. "To the hard-working young lady you just deliberately assaulted." The drunk guest scoffed loudly, but clearly intimidated by Declan's calm, unwavering presence and the judgmental stares of the other wealthy patrons gathering around. He angrily muttered an insincere apology and stumbled away into the crowd. Declan immediately turned his attention to me, gently offering a crisp, white silk handkerchief from his breast pocket. He did not look at me with any hint of pity or disgust at my stained, cheap clothes. He just smiled so warmly. "Are you all right?" he asked. That was the precise moment I foolishly let my heavy guard down. Declan quickly proved to be what I thought was the absolutely perfect man. Over the course of the next 12 months, he never once showed an ounce of care about my rough, calloused hands, my permanently dusty boots, or the meager, pathetic salary I brought home every 2 weeks. He would happily pick me up in his polished luxury sedan, looking completely unbothered by the rusty, dented Ford parked right next to it in my trailer park. When I talked passionately for hours about soil pH levels and endangered fern species, he would just sit there on my cheap couch, resting his chin on his hand, listening to every single word I said with the most gentle, adoring expression on his handsome face. I was completely and utterly swept off my feet. I sank so deeply into the warm, comforting safety of his consistent presence that I was entirely blinded to the truth. Looking back now, with the painful clarity of hindsight, the glaring red flags were woven seamlessly into the very fabric of his supposed perfection. His endless patience and his strict refusal to ever raise his voice seemed like the obvious traits of a deeply kind, protective soul. I genuinely thought he was my safe harbor. I did not realize until it was far too late that his so-called gentleness was actually nothing more than profound cowardice. Whenever we faced even a minor disagreement with a rude waiter, an unreasonable neighbor, or an aggressive stranger on the street, Declan would simply agree with them, folding instantly and completely to avoid any sort of friction whatsoever. His perfectly curated aura of peace was actually a desperate, spineless avoidance of conflict, masterfully disguised as aristocratic charm, but at that specific time, wrapped tightly in the warm illusion of his unconditional love. I had absolutely no idea that I was happily walking straight into a meticulously designed trap. The illusion of my perfect, peaceful life reached its absolute peak on a rainy Tuesday evening. Declan took me to our favorite little 24-hour diner on the edge of town, a place where the vinyl booths were cracked and the coffee was always slightly burnt. We were sharing a plate of greasy fries when he suddenly reached across the sticky table, took my dirt-stained hand in his, and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a remarkably modest, simple diamond ring. He looked deeply into my eyes and asked me to marry him. I did not care that the ring was small. I did not care that we were surrounded by the smell of cheap frying oil. I said yes with tears streaming down my face, entirely convinced that I had finally found my permanent safe harbor, a man who loved me exactly for who I was, far away from the toxic weight of my grandfather's billion-dollar shadow. The very next weekend, the dream began to crack, exposing the rotting foundation underneath. Declan drove me to his family estate in one of the most exclusive, gated neighborhoods in Austin to officially introduce me as his fiancée. As we pulled into the massive circular driveway, my stomach tied itself into a tight knot. The Sterling mansion was not a home. It was a loud, desperate cry for attention. It was a gaudy, chaotic mix of faux European architecture, towering marble columns, and completely unnecessary gold accents that screamed new money. It was the exact kind of superficial wealth I had run away from. Inside, the air felt thin and suffocating. I was introduced to his mother, Valerie, a woman whose face was pulled terrifyingly tight by countless cosmetic procedures. She was draped head to toe in heavily branded designer clothing, treating her luxury logos like a suit of armor against the world. Next to her was Blair, Declan's younger sister, an aspiring social media influencer who barely looked up from her glowing phone screen. She spent the entire introduction adjusting her ring light and pouting for her followers, completely ignoring my existence until she realized my simple canvas jacket did not fit her carefully curated aesthetic. Dinner was an agonizing, suffocating exercise in psychological warfare. We sat at a dining table long enough to seat 20 people. Though there were only 4 of us, Valerie swirled her red wine, looking down her surgically enhanced nose at my unpolished fingernails. "So, Kira," Valerie began, her voice dripping with venom thinly disguised as polite conversation. "Espinoza, that is a very ethnic name. Are you from one of those large, noisy immigrant families from down south?" I kept my voice perfectly level. "My family is from Texas, Mrs. Sterling. We have been here for generations." Valerie let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Right. And Declan tells me you work with dirt. A gardener, was it? How uniquely quaint. Tell me, do you ever manage to scrub the smell of cheap fertilizer out of your hair? Or is that just your permanent signature scent now?" I immediately looked across the table at Declan, waiting for the man who once bravely stood up to a drunk stranger to defend his future wife. Instead, Declan was staring intensely down at his lap, silently tapping away on his phone screen. He did not say a single word. He did not even flinch. The heavy, humiliating silence stretched on for what felt like hours, wrapping tightly around my throat. I swallowed my pride, desperately telling myself he was just trying to avoid a family argument, but the absolute worst was yet to come. Just 3 days later, I received a cold text message from Valerie, instructing me to meet her at a private country club cafe. When I arrived, she did not bother with pleasantries. She did not even offer me a glass of water. She simply slid a thick, bound legal folder across the pristine white table. "What is this?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "It is a standard non-disclosure agreement, along with a formal petition for a legal name change," Valerie stated flatly, crossing her arms. "If you are going to marry my son and enter the Sterling family, you are going to drop the name Espinoza completely. You will legally change your last name before the wedding, and you will sign that contract legally binding you to never discuss your trailer park background, your lowly landscaping job, or your pathetic, poor roots with any of our high net worth investors. You are a complete liability to our brand. Kira, I will not let a girl who shovels manure embarrass my family in high society." The sheer audacity of her demand left me momentarily breathless. She was demanding I erase my entire identity, the very heritage I was so quietly proud of, just to serve as a pretty silent prop for their arrogant facade. I stared at the contract, feeling a deep, ancient fire waking up in my blood. It was the very same ruthless fire that ran through my grandfather's veins. I firmly pushed the folder back across the table. "I am not signing a single page of this," I said, my voice cold and steady. "And I am keeping my name." I stood up and walked out, expecting a massive fight when I got home to Declan. I expected him to be furious with his mother for overstepping such a massive boundary. When he arrived at my trailer that evening, I handed him the paperwork Valerie had forced on me. I waited for his outrage. Instead, my perfect, protective fiancé completely shattered right in front of my eyes. Declan read the document, his face draining of all color. Then, to my absolute horror, he dropped to his knees on my cheap linoleum floor. Tears actually began pouring down his cheeks. "Please, Kira," he sobbed, his voice cracking pitifully. "Please just sign it. It is just a piece of paper. You know how my mother gets when she is stressed about the company's investors. If you do not sign it, she is going to make my life an absolute living hell. Just give up the name. Just do this for me, to save face for her. Please, do not make this harder on me than it already is." I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet, weeping not because my dignity had been completely shredded, but because he was entirely incapable of standing up to his own mother. The man I thought was my protector was nothing but a fragile, spineless puppet. The warm, comforting blanket of our relationship instantly turned to ice. Exactly 48 hours before the official engagement party was set to begin, a massive, glossy black delivery box was unceremoniously dumped on the rickety wooden steps of my trailer. Inside lay a dress chosen specifically by Valerie. To call it a dress would be an incredibly generous overstatement. It was a chaotic explosion of neon pink synthetic silk, heavily slashed at the waist and chest in a desperately vulgar attempt at high fashion. The fabric was aggressively weighed down by thousands of incredibly cheap, blindingly reflective fake rhinestones. Pinned to the plunging neckline was a stiff, heavily perfumed card covered in Valerie's jagged handwriting. Wear this on Saturday. If you are going to be photographed with my family, you will at least try to look like you genuinely belong in high society. Do not embarrass us. I held the garish, heavily beaded monstrosity up to the dim, flickering light of my living room. It felt impossibly heavy, entirely unnatural, and deeply insulting to my core. It was the absolute physical manifestation of everything the Sterling family stood for. It was loud, it was horribly expensive, and it was completely devoid of any real soul or substance. Without a single second of hesitation or regret, I marched straight into my tiny kitchen and shoved the entire neon pink disaster directly into my plastic garbage can, pressing it down until it sank completely beneath empty coffee grounds and discarded vegetable peels. I already knew exactly what I was going to wear, and I did not need Valerie Sterling to dictate my worth. Deep inside my small closet, carefully preserved inside a breathable cotton garment bag, hung a dress I had been working on for the past 2 years. It was a beautifully structured, elegantly simple ivory gown, but it's true. Immeasurable value lay entirely in the details. Woven meticulously into the shoulders and cascading gently down the deep neckline were pieces of delicate, antique Spanish lace. That beautiful white lace was not just fabric bought from a store, it was cut directly from the preserved wedding veil of my late grandmother. While my grandfather Alejandro was the terrifying titan of the business world, my grandmother was the steady, unbreakable, and fiercely proud soul of our family. I had spent countless late nights after my long, exhausting shifts at the conservatory, sitting under a single yellow light bulb, carefully hand-embroidering tiny silver vines to blend the antique lace seamlessly into the modern silk. It was a profound, deeply personal symbol of my bloodline, a quiet but incredibly powerful testament to my true heritage. Slipping felt exactly like wrapping myself in my grandmother's absolute strength. I knew I was going to desperately need that protective armor tonight. The engagement party was being held at the Oakwood Crest Country Club, an intensely private, highly guarded fortress built exclusively to cater to Austin's wealthiest, most untouchable elites. When my rusty, rattling truck pulled up to the grand, sweeping entrance, the young valet attendant looked utterly bewildered, hesitating to even reach out and touch my keys. Taking a deep breath to steady my rapidly racing heart, I stepped out of the vehicle, smoothed down the soft silk of my skirt, and walked confidently through the towering double oak doors. The sheer visual contrast between my quiet, grounded dignity and their frantic, desperate display of wealth was immediately suffocating. The massive, cavernous ballroom was dripping with oversized crystal chandeliers that cast a harsh, glaring light over everything. Towering, excessively expensive floral arrangements blocked the sightlines across the room, looking significantly more like aggressive barricades than welcoming decorations. The air was thick and heavy, reeking of expensive designer perfumes violently mixed with the sharp scent of spilled gin. The room was absolutely packed to the brim with hundreds of guests draped in heavily branded designer labels, clutching expensive champagne flutes like weapons. The exact second my worn leather heel crossed the threshold into the main hall, the loud, booming jazz music seemed to physically stall. A heavy, highly uncomfortable silence rippled rapidly outward from the grand entrance. Hundreds of heads snapped aggressively in my direction. The Austin elite, a vicious, toxic mix of arrogant old money and desperate new money, stopped whatever they were doing to openly and shamelessly stare at me. I could instantly feel the sharp, scrutinizing weight of their collective gaze, burning directly into my skin. Their judgmental eyes raked brutally over my simple ivory gown, actively searching for a recognizable luxury designer logo and finding absolutely nothing but my hand-embroidered antique lace. Before I could even attempt to locate Declan in the massive sea of dark tailored suits, a loud, piercing screech of audio feedback echoed violently through the entire ballroom. Valerie Sterling was standing directly in the center of the main dance floor, a glowing white spotlight strictly focused on her. She was clutching a silver microphone tightly in her heavily manicured hand, her lips twisted into a terrifyingly wide, predatory smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished investors, and esteemed business partners," Valerie announced, her amplified voice dripping with a sickly sweet, entirely fake warmth that made my stomach aggressively churn. "Please turn your absolute attention to the main entrance. It appears our guest of honor has finally decided to grace us with her presence." She paused deliberately, letting the suffocating, heavy silence stretch until it became physically painful to endure. Then, she raised her free hand and pointed a perfectly polished, accusing finger straight at my chest. "Oh, Kira, my dear," Valerie cooed mockingly into the microphone, her sharp voice echoing mercilessly off the high marble walls. "We sent you a stunning, exclusively imported designer piece specifically for tonight. Yet, you chose to show up in a homemade, painfully plain little frock. Tell me, did you find that dusty old fabric at a neighborhood garage sale? Or did you simply stitch together some leftover, moth-eaten curtains from your charming little trailer park?" A collective, undeniably cruel gasp rippled rapidly through the wealthy crowd, instantly followed by a massive wave of sharp, ugly laughter, my face flushed with a sudden, violent heat. Valerie was not just casually insulting my clothes. She was actively, deliberately weaponizing my supposed poverty to deeply entertain her high-net-worth investors, strategically turning me into a pathetic, walking punchline to solidify her own arrogant superiority in the room. The humiliation escalated with a truly terrifying speed. All around me, impeccably dressed guests began eagerly pulling out their wildly expensive smartphones. The blinding white flashes of their cameras hit my face like rapid physical blows. I could hear their vicious, unbothered whispers cutting sharply through the air from every single direction. "Is that really the girl Declan is marrying? She looks utterly impoverished. I heard she literally digs in the dirt for a living, probably works for minimum wage. Look at that sad, pathetic dress. She is clearly just desperate for a quick payday from the Sterling family." They were actively recording me, pointing their perfectly manicured fingers and laughing as if I were a caged animal brought in strictly for their cruel evening amusement. I stood completely frozen in the grand doorway, the antique lace of my grandmother's veil pressing gently against my collarbone, serving as an agonizingly stark contrast to the hollow, cheap cruelty currently surrounding me. I desperately searched the laughing, jeering crowd for Declan, praying with every fiber of my being for him to finally step forward, take the microphone away from his vicious mother, and defend the woman he supposedly loved. But he remained completely hidden in the shadows, leaving me entirely alone to face the absolute worst of their aristocratic wrath. The relentless, blinding flashes of smartphone cameras completely disoriented me, creating a chaotic strobe light effect across the massive ballroom. I was entirely trapped in the center of a very wealthy, very vicious mob. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a sudden, rapid movement. It was Blair. She was aggressively pushing her way through the laughing crowd, clutching a massive crystal goblet filled to the absolute brim with a deep, dark red vintage wine. Her eyes were locked directly onto my chest, and a completely unhinged, malicious grin was plastered across her heavily contoured face. Time seemed to instantly slow down to a grueling, agonizing crawl. When she was exactly 3 feet away from me, Blair performed a highly exaggerated, incredibly fake stumble. She threw her arms forward, intentionally launching the entire contents of her heavy crystal glass straight at my body. The dark crimson liquid hit me with a shocking, icy force. It splashed violently across my collarbone, immediately soaking into the delicate ivory silk of my bodice and directly saturating the pristine white antique lace on my right shoulder. The dark red stain rapidly expanded like a blooming, ugly bruise across the very fabric I had spent 2 agonizingly long years meticulously hand-stitching. For a fraction of a second, I was completely paralyzed by the sheer shock of the freezing liquid and the absolute cruelty of the act. I stood there, gasping for air, staring down at my ruined masterpiece, but Blair was not finished. Before I could even attempt to wipe the dripping wine from my face, she lunged forward with a sudden, vicious burst of energy, Under the flimsy disguise of clumsily trying to wipe the spill away, she aggressively grabbed the soaking wet fabric on my shoulder. Her sharp, heavily manicured acrylic nails dug painfully right through the wet silk and directly into my skin. "Oh my God! Look at what a massive, clumsy mess you are!" Blair hissed viciously under her breath, her voice barely a harsh whisper meant only for my ears, even as she maintained a look of fake theatrical panic for the dozens of camera phones still recording us. With a sudden, violent yank, Blair closed her fists tightly around the antique Spanish lace. She pulled downward with all of her aggressive bodily force. The sickening, brutally loud sound of thick threads snapping and delicate fabric tearing in half echoed sharply in my ears. I felt a violent jerk as she forcefully ripped the heirloom lace completely away from the silk bodice, the incredibly precious fabric, cut from my late grandmother's sacred wedding veil. The very last physical piece of her beautiful legacy that I possessed was violently shredded into jagged, wine-soaked strips right in front of my eyes. She let the torn, ruined pieces drop onto the cold marble floor, intentionally grinding the heel of her expensive stiletto directly into the wet fabric. Before I could even process the absolute devastation of my grandmother's ruined veil, Valerie came storming through the crowd, practically vibrating with a terrifying, self-righteous fury. She aggressively shoved her way to the front, pointing her finger right at my face. Her voice was amplified by the sheer volume of her manufactured rage, designed specifically to capture the absolute attention of every single wealthy investor in the room. "You showed up in a cheap dress. Are you trying to embarrass my family?" Valerie screamed into my face, her voice echoing violently off the high, vaulted ceilings. "You come into our private club looking like an absolute beggar, smelling like cheap liquor, and causing a massive, humiliating scene in front of our most important corporate partners? You are a complete and utter disgrace." My chest heaved as I desperately struggled to draw a full breath. The wine was actively dripping down my arms, and the jagged, torn edge of my dress hung pathetically off my shoulder. I was completely surrounded by a pack of hungry wolves, all of them laughing, pointing, and recording my absolute lowest, most vulnerable moment. In a sheer, desperate panic, my eyes frantically scanned the dense crowd. I was searching for my fiancé. I was searching for the man who promised to protect me. I finally found him. Declan was standing about 20 feet away, nervously clutching a glass of scotch, hovering right next to a small group of highly influential real estate investors. Our eyes locked intensely across the room. I silently begged him with my gaze. I waited for him to finally step up, to march across that floor, to take off his suit jacket and wrap it around my exposed, shivering shoulders. I waited for him to finally act like a real man and fiercely defend the woman he supposedly wanted to marry. Declan looked directly at my tear-filled eyes. Then, he looked at the incredibly wealthy investors standing next to him, who were openly sneering at my ruined state. I watched the exact moment his fragile spine completely crumbled, all the color rapidly drained from his handsome face. He swallowed hard, took 3 large, deliberate steps backward, firmly turned his back to me, and cowardly rushed away toward the mahogany bar, instantly vanishing into the shadows of the club. He had completely abandoned me on the battlefield. The absolute devastation of his betrayal hit me far harder than the wine or the ruined dress. I stood completely frozen in the center of the massive room, my heart shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Eventually, the cruel crowd began to lose interest in the paralyzed, crying girl. The loud jazz music resumed, and the wealthy guests slowly turned back to their expensive drinks, leaving me completely isolated in a sticky puddle of spilled wine. As I stood there, violently shivering and completely numb, 2 older gentlemen in immaculate tailored suits stepped slightly closer to my general area, lighting thick imported cigars. They did not even notice I was standing there in the shadows, entirely absorbed in their own hushed, mocking conversation. "Valerie is putting on quite the desperate theatrical show tonight," the first man chuckled darkly, taking a long drag of his cigar. "It is honestly pathetic. They are trying so hard to project massive wealth, but the entire industry already knows the absolute truth." "Exactly, Buzz," the second man replied, keeping his voice to a harsh, low whisper. The Sterling family is completely underwater. They are drowning in over $50 million of toxic debt. I heard from a federal contact just yesterday that the authorities are officially preparing to indict the entire family for massive corporate fraud and money laundering. They are literally standing on the absolute edge of severe prison time. They do not have a single dime left to their arrogant names. The first man laughed cruelly. That is exactly why they threw this ridiculously expensive, flashy party. It is a massive, carefully orchestrated scam. They used their very last line of credit to rent this club, desperately hoping to bait that mysterious out-of-town billionaire investor into showing up tonight. They are praying this unknown tycoon will blindly inject enough liquid capital to save their fraudulent sinking ship before the federal agents kick their mansion doors down by tomorrow morning. I stood there in the cold, freezing silence of my own mind, my ruined grandmother's lace hanging off my shoulder. The profound shock slowly began to recede, rapidly replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. The Sterlings were not rich. They were broke, desperate, highly toxic criminals dangling right over the edge of a massive cliff. And they had absolutely no idea that the mysterious, incredibly powerful billionaire they were so desperately waiting for to save their pathetic, fraudulent lives was the very same man who shared my exact last name. The whispered revelations of the two businessmen had barely settled into my mind when Valerie's sharp, piercing voice cut through the heavy air once again. She had spotted me standing frozen in the shadows, covered in spilled wine, and she went entirely unsatisfied with simply humiliating me. She wanted me completely erased from her sight. Raising her heavily jeweled hand high into the air, she snapped her fingers aggressively at two large, intimidating security guards stationed near the exit. "Get this pathetic, filthy creature out of my sight," Valerie commanded loudly, waving her hand as if she were shooing away a stray, diseased dog. "Throw her out the back service doors where she belongs. I will not have her staining the floors of this club for another second." The two massive guards immediately stepped forward, their faces completely void of any emotion, reaching their thick hands out to grab my bare arms. But before their fingers could even graze my skin, a sound like a sudden thunderclap violently shook the entire ballroom. The massive, solid oak double doors at the main entrance were kicked open with such a terrifying, explosive physical force that the heavy brass handles violently struck the marble walls, shattering the plaster behind them. The lively jazz music cut off in an absolute instant. A paralyzing, dead silence fell over the hundreds of wealthy guests. Striding through the shattered doorway was my grandfather, Alejandro Espinoza. He was the oldest, most ruthless wolf in the entire Texas business world, a man whose mere presence was known to make seasoned corporate executives physically tremble. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal wool suit, walking with the heavy, undeniable stride of a king entering a conquered territory. Flanking him closely on all sides was a highly intimidating, tightly packed phalanx of cold-faced corporate lawyers holding thick leather briefcases and broad-shouldered private security contractors in pitch-black suits. A sudden, electric jolt of desperate hope visibly surged through the entire Sterling family. From across the massive room, Valerie's eyes lit up with a wild, greedy fire. I watched as she frantically smoothed down her hair, entirely mistaking my grandfather for the mysterious, unnamed billionaire investor they had been begging for months to save them from federal prison. She shoved her way past the stunned crowd, a sickeningly sweet, sycophantic smile instantly painted across her tightly pulled face. "Oh, sir, you have arrived," Valerie practically sang, rushing directly toward the terrifying titan of industry with both of her hands outstretched in greedy anticipation. "We are so incredibly honored that you decided to grace our little gathering with your presence tonight. I am Valerie Sterling, and my family has been eagerly awaiting your arrival." Alejandro did not even break his stride. He treated Valerie Sterling exactly like a piece of invisible, worthless trash on the sidewalk. He walked straight past her outstretched hands without offering her a single glance, leaving her awkwardly stumbling backward to avoid being trampled by his massive security team. His piercing, terrifyingly sharp eyes were locked solely on one person in the entire room, me. When he finally stopped directly in front of me, the terrifying aura of the ruthless billionaire instantly softened. He looked down at my shivering, wine-soaked frame, his eyes tracing the violently torn, ragged edges of my grandmother's sacred antique lace. Without saying a single word, he smoothly unbuttoned his heavy, incredibly expensive cashmere overcoat. He slipped it off his broad shoulders and gently, almost reverently, wrapped the warm, thick fabric tightly around my trembling body, carefully shielding my torn dress and my exposed skin from the vicious stares of the crowd. The comforting, familiar scent of cedar and rich tobacco enveloped me, instantly anchoring me to reality. Then, Alejandro slowly turned his body around to face the center of the room. The absolute silence in the ballroom was so thick, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. His dark, furious eyes swept slowly across the terrified crowd of Austin elites like a cold, bloody blade. When his gaze finally landed on Valerie, who was now trembling visibly near the edge of the dance floor, his voice erupted with the terrifying, bone-chilling force of a localized earthquake. "You spent the last 6 months crawling on your pathetic knees, begging my holding company to come here tonight to inject liquid capital and save your fraudulent garbage company from complete ruin," Alejandro roared, his booming voice echoing mercilessly off the high crystal chandeliers. "While you have the absolute suicidal audacity to stand here and violently tear the clothes off the body of the sole, undisputed heir to the entire Espinosa empire." The brutal declaration dropped into the center of the opulent ballroom exactly like a detonated nuclear bomb. The sheer shockwave of his words physically shattered the fragile reality of every single person in the room. A loud, sharp cracking sound echoed as Blair's expensive smartphone slipped directly out of her paralyzed hands and completely shattered against the hard marble floor. Valerie let out a highly disturbing, breathless gasp, her knees completely giving out beneath her as she staggered and collapsed into an undignified heap on the ground. The hundreds of wealthy guests, who just minutes ago had been laughing and recording my absolute humiliation, were now violently recoiling in sheer, unadulterated horror. The collective realization washed over them in a terrifying, icy wave. The helpless, dirt-stained girl they had just ruthlessly mocked and degraded was actually the supreme master of a fortune so vast, it could completely wipe their entire existence off the map with a single, casual signature. The heavy, suffocating silence in the massive ballroom was abruptly broken by the sharp, echoing snap of my grandfather's fingers. Immediately, his lead corporate attorney stepped sharply forward. Opening a thick leather briefcase, he pulled out a massive, heavy stack of officially stamped legal documents and handed them to Alejandro, without a single ounce of hesitation. My grandfather threw the heavy stack of papers directly at Valerie's feet, the crisp white pages scattering wildly across the polished marble dance floor. "I did not come here tonight to blindly invest a single cent in your sinking, pathetic ship," Alejandro stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded the absolute, undivided attention of every single wealthy guest in the room. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, Espinosa Holdings officially purchased 100% of your toxic corporate debt from your highly panicked creditors. We now completely own every single asset attached to the Sterling name." Before Valerie could even attempt to process the devastating weight of his words, the lead attorney cleared his throat loudly. "Mrs. Sterling," the lawyer announced, projecting his stern voice so the entire club could hear clearly. "This serves as your official, legally binding notice of immediate foreclosure. As of this exact moment, your sprawling estate, your luxury vehicles, and all of your previously frozen corporate accounts are the sole property of Espinosa Holdings. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises, or armed law enforcement will forcefully remove you from the property." He calmly dropped a bright yellow eviction notice right onto her lap as she sat weeping silently on the cold stone floor. Alejandro was not finished. He slowly turned his piercing, icy gaze toward Blair, who was hyperventilating aggressively against a tall cocktail table. "And as for your highly popular, superficial little media company, Alejandro sneered, his lip curling in absolute unfiltered disgust. My forensic accountants spent exactly 3 hours analyzing your hidden books this afternoon. It is nothing more than an incredibly sloppy, amateur money laundering front used to hide millions of dollars. A comprehensive digital dossier containing every single piece of your fraudulent evidence is being hand-delivered to the Federal Bureau of Investigation tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. None of you are going to escape a lengthy stay in federal prison. The sheer, absolute finality of his brutal punishment finally snapped Declan out of his cowardly stupor. He rushed frantically across the room, completely abandoning whatever shred of aristocratic dignity he had left, and threw himself violently to his knees right at my feet. He reached out with shaking hands, desperately clutching the hem of my ruined silk dress. "Kira, please, you have to stop him," Declan sobbed uncontrollably, heavy, pathetic tears streaming rapidly down his flushed face. "I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea she was going to do this to you tonight. It was all my mother, I swear to you. She forced me into this entirely. I love you. Kira, I truly, deeply love you. Please, just tell him to stop. Give me another chance." I looked down at the weeping, broken man kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely no anger, no profound sadness, and certainly no love. I felt nothing but a cold, heavy emptiness. Slowly, I reached down to my left hand and slid the modest, simple diamond ring off my finger. I held it up for a brief second, watching it catch the harsh light of the expensive crystal chandeliers. Right beside him, resting on a low silver tray left behind by a fleeing waiter, was a half-empty glass of expensive vintage champagne. I coldly dropped the ring directly into the bubbling liquid, watching it sink rapidly to the very bottom. "A man who does not dare to stand up and protect me in the light drizzle," I said, my voice completely hollow and dead, "has absolutely no right to seek shelter under my umbrella when the hurricane hits." Without giving him a single extra second of my time, I turned my back on Declan Sterling forever. I gently slipped my hand through my grandfather's offered arm. Together, flanked entirely by our silent, intimidating wall of security, we walked slowly and confidently out of the grand double doors. We left the entire Sterling family screaming and weeping bitterly in the massive, smoking ruins of the fake empire they had so arrogantly destroyed with their own hands. Money can easily buy the most expensive, flashy clothes to temporarily cover up extreme incompetence, but there is absolutely no amount of wealth in the entire world that can successfully hide a rotting, toxic personality. You must be very careful with exactly how you treat the quiet people who appear to have nothing in their hands, because you never truly know how incredibly massive the shadow standing behind them really is. Thank you so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to my story today. My wonderful and cherished friends, where in the world are you currently tuning in from? Please let me know down in the comments below. If you found today's journey compelling and enjoyed the story, please remember that we unfortunately have absolutely no budget left and will not be uploading any new videos here on YouTube in the foreseeable future. We are transitioning our entire operation over to Patreon, so please kindly help us survive by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to the absolute best, highly exclusive, and much longer true stories that we simply cannot publicize on YouTube. You can easily join us right now by scanning the Patreon QR code displayed on your screen, or by using the link provided in the description or the pinned comment below.